Hajime!
Greetings, Legionaries. I am glad to be back from my advisory trip to a nondescript certain strongman, as they say in the liberal media, but I would like to call him a father of his nation, a certain individual who keeps things squared away. Suffice it to say, it's a man who I admire deeply and who keeps his capital clean. The streets are well tended to. The cars are all white, by the way, because it's just too much clash, you see. It's just, it ruins the aesthetic of his city if the color of the cars clash and there's a uniformity in the style. I go too far, but, you know, check out Turkmenistan. It's pretty interesting. Anyway, I get too far ahead of myself, right? And in all seriousness, though, when I conceive of the reason behind these transmissions, it goes beyond simply talking about the martial ethos, the sciences and arts of military science and arts, but it's to be a prince. Like Machiavelli said, a prince is not merely a military leader, although it is an essential aspect of it. It is also the rule of men. Am I not wrong? And so when we understand what that means, the implicitness of what to rule men is to do, or rather, what does it mean per se, well, it is to understand key concepts of justice. What is justice? What is legitimacy? What are these organs of basically societal functioning which you're able to properly govern and help your country or city-state, whatever your polity, your principality, to flourish, right? How do we give human flourishing and excellence? And human flourishing, of course, is not defined merely by simply, are they well-fed, are they, quote-unquote, happy? Because happiness is stupid. It's a red herring, and I hope we can dispense with that up front. But the purpose over the arc is about high achievement in humanity, the refinement and elevation of man as such, man, woman, the family unit, the polity, the culture, the art, the sciences. Every facet of humanity is enervated and brought to its fruition. All of this is built on a foundation of justice, right? And a nation, as Nietzsche would say, is a purpose, right? So every nation has its unique exceptionality, its own. So I don't believe in universalism, right? We believe in exception, the exception, right? In America, we call this exceptionalism. This quality in which that makes us unique, which we have a supremacy of value. We ascribe a good, right? And therefore, from that good, we orient ourselves. It's our axiom. So for instance, you know, as Nietzsche said, the Persians, it was to shoot straight and speak the truth. And you see this in real terms in their religion, right? Religion, for those of you who don't understand what religion truly is, it is the irrational axiom. It's a philosophy or quote-unquote ideology, but it's ideology and philosophy are all forms of religion, right? That is religion at its base. It is the irrational and basically irreconcilable starting point and reason. It is the telos of a nation. And so why do I say this? Well, when we are princes, our task is to bring to fruition a state so that it may more fully bring about individuals who best encapsulate the values which we hold within. And these values, so for instance, the Neoplatonists are the ones who culminated Christianity into the idea of divine right, and ultimately were the ones who basically elucidated through Thomas Aquinas and all that kind of stuff what right looks like, what it is that they're trying to bring about as an ideal for life. And from there, the culture springs and flourishes, and man, either through the arts or the sciences, in every facet of humanity in their lives, are all marching to this common drum, this common cause, right? So it brings us together. It's the fiber, that golden fiber that gives purpose and meaning to our existence. Now, it's not something we necessarily understand in time, in being. This is something that when we're in the cockpit, we're in the weeds per se. We can't see the big picture. We can't really zoom out. Anything that we are truly emotionally attached to is something we can't unemotionally, or rather the vast majority of us, with very few exceptions, or who are prescient and amazing minds, are able to, visualize the big picture, right? So I guess what I'm trying to say is that ultimately justice is the approximation of society towards this goal and the flourishing of the principality towards those ends. Okay. Now, with all that said and done, it's important to understand the delineation between justice, nature, about how the Socratics, and the Socratics are Socrates, Plato, Aristotle, everyone who basically comes from that original point in classical Hellenic culture that birthed philosophy and ultimately gave voice, articulation to what it means to be just. For Plato, or rather Socrates, the idea of justice was a good in itself. But I think it's really important that we kind of backstep here. And we don't talk about Aristotle, we don't talk about Socrates or Plato for this specific transmission. I think it's important that we reference Aristotle, and further, a reading of Aristotle through Strauss. Leo Strauss is a great philosophical mind. He has personal convictions, political convictions that are not my own. He's a neoconservative. I am not a neoconservative. However, I'm not a believer in this whole idea that just because the enemy says something good or bad, that we should completely disregard this individual. We can learn even from our enemies, right? And he wrote this great book called The City and Man. And in this first transmission, I'll be talking about one of the parts within it, which is about Aristotle. And just without further ado, what I would like you to understand about reality is to just completely discard everything you understand about how you live right now, and think to yourself instead of man as an animal. Just start as an animal, whether it's a tiger or a lion, or a herd of horses ranging on the prairie, or so on and so forth. But man is unique, right? Because we have these layers of complexity, and I would even believe that we have free will. I personally believe that. Although for this understanding, I think it's important that you can see us as a natural being, a biological one, where we have, biological imperatives and ways of being in the world which are unique. And between peoples, we see this uniqueness self-selecting and differentiating between different populations of humans. Much in the same way, we see subspeciation within very specific species. And I think this wouldn't necessarily qualify because breeds don't necessarily meet the threshold of subspecies. But take, for instance, a horse breed, for instance. You have Mustangs, and you have, draft horses. You have, different war horses and Arabian stallions and so on and so forth. Each has its quality. One is swift of foot. The other is sturdy and strong. One has a strength here and another there, but their excellences are not diminished by their deficiencies, quote unquote, rather, right? So you don't take a draft horse to do a marathon run across a desert. You take an Arabian stallion who is swift of foot and sturdy and who is able to experience hardship of the desert more uniquely than any other animal, right? And I think it's really important that you understand humans as such. I mean, for instance, the great example is, of course, the French invasion under Napoleon of Egypt, and how the French soldiers themselves from the mainland were ill-accustomed to the climate, to the point where they were experiencing desert blindness in otherwise circumstances where the Bedouin were not at all affected. Even when they changed over and they had clothing which was more fitting to their environment, they still weren't as biologically attuned to their environment as those who had been there for thousands of years, right? Now, if we're able to just zoom back to ancient Greece, think of it this way, as the Greeks, or rather even the subpopulations of Greeks who were actually significantly different. So we had the Dorians, and we had the Ionians, and we had a number of different, nations, really, that would compose of the Hellenic world. Even the Macedonians were not seen necessarily as Greek until, I think it was Philip II of Macedon who imposed himself upon the city-states of Greece when he conquered them and forced them to accept the Macedonian champions into the competitions of the Olympics, like at Delphi, right? And so why am I saying this? Because ultimately we need to understand nature as such and understand man naturally. And man naturally has exigencies, or rather things which are immutable, in the sense that they're immutable in the immediate generation. It takes thousands of years and hundreds of generations for speciation to occur, right? It takes a long time for unique populations to emerge. This is the project. This is the idea that Nietzsche talks about, how a nation is really the multi-generational breeding, self-selecting along that axiom that I told you about earlier over time to basically create man as such, a specific man. So for instance, the Corsicans existed as a unique people for thousands of years, quite literally since before the collapse of the Bronze Age, to ultimately give birth to Napoleon, and so on and so forth. I won't go further, but the idea is that you have to understand that man is nature, okay? But what we superimpose upon ourselves, the ideal that we hold for ourselves, which is abstract, which is, let's say, irrational or rather rational combined, the ideal that we have, that is what is called the nomos, or the nomoi, right? And this is different from nature, physis. So the foundation is the biological, and the ideal, right? Our ideals, the reasons why we do things, our ideology, our religion, right? Our religion, that is man-made. And the nomoi, or the nomos, of any specific nation is unique to itself. It is the very thing that both constructs a unique, quote-unquote, identity, but really it's a mission, right? A multi-generational mission that will ultimately shape the biological form of that nation towards its ends. We see the best examples of this in Sparta, but I get ahead of myself a little bit too much. And for us to understand this is essential, right? Because when you're a prince, the idea is that you have to understand that you must have ideals, and also you have a stock, which is what is comprised within your principality. And within that principality, there's an order of rank, or what we call, quote-unquote, caste. And each is an approximation in function and form of both their type and quality, but also their ability. And there's ever increasing ability, right? So you start with the, the labor merchant class, and then you have the warrior class, and then you have the priestly philosophical kings class, right? And each is of increasing better ability. So think better IQ, better physical ability, better temperament, specifically tailored for both the ideal set for itself as well as just simply a more robust being in every facet or case of life. And so when you start to understand that, when you take this for granted, and like I said, just bear with me here, you don't have to agree with me, but the concept is that at first we must accept this basic truth. Aristotle then goes on to explain what it is, the different mechanics of a city-state. Now, what is a city-state? For the Greeks, it's something extremely different from what you and I think. When you think city-state, you just think of like a city, right? Which is a city and a wall, and it's a pile of bricks or marble, a pantheon, but it's something actually quite different. It's the body politic. It is the culture. It is one and the same of both culture, politic, and political function, war-making ability, and ideals, culture, etc. It is all things ground into one, right? It is like this nexus, and the closest approximation that we have, which would be accurate, is to basically explain the nation state as such, which is to say my country. When we say my country, what we're doing is ultimately championing the same things these ancient Hellenes championed, right? It is, we're ascribing a cultural, cultural biological composition, which is again the ethne, right? Because an ethnic group is not simply a biological quote-unquote race or whatever you want to call it. I hate using that word, but because it has so many negative connotations, but see it shorn of any liberal smearing. Just the biological foundation met with a cultural conditioning, right? So, for instance, if I took a German European from birth and raised them in Nigeria with a Nigerian family, they wouldn't be of the same ethnicity as a German. Even though, biologically speaking, he would be German, he wouldn't actually be a man of the ethne. Now, this is one and the same. Again, going back to what a city-state is, what a country is ultimately a patria, or what's called a fatherland, right? So, once you understand this, we come to the question of, actually, even before going too far, what I'm going to go ahead and read from Strauss, which he better explains what I'm trying to get at here. 1 second. I'm going to read from Strauss, and this is where Aristotle actually overcomes or improves upon this individual named Hippodamus. I recommend you read the book to understand the background, but I'll give you the synopsis later, or maybe in another post. But the most important thing is that Aristotle arises at the political from a contradistinction of Hippodamus. And so I read from Strauss now. Hippodamus didn't succeed in founding political philosophy or political science because he did not begin by raising the question of what is political, or rather, what is the polis? This question, and all questions of this kind, were raised by Socrates, who, for this reason, became the founder of political philosophy. The what is questions point to essences, to essential differences, to the fact that the whole consists of parts, which are heterogeneous, not merely sensibly, like fire, air, water, and earth, but noetically. And noetically, by the way, means poetically. It means something like, a kind of, not poetic in the sense of like just merely art, but kind of a flourish that is not exactly hard science, right? It's an art as opposed to the science. Okay, reading again. To understand the whole means to understand the what of each of these parts, of these classes of beings, and how they are linked with one another. Such understanding cannot be reduced
of one heterogeneous class to others, or to any cause of causes other than the class itself. The class, or the class character, is the cause par excellence. Socrates conceived of his turn to the what is questions as a turn or a return to sanity, to common sense, while the roots of the whole are hidden. The whole manifest consists of heterogeneous parts. One may say that according to Socrates, the things which are the first in themselves are somehow first for us. The things which are first in themselves are in a manner, but necessarily revealed in men's opinions. Those opinions have as opinions a certain order. The highest opinions, the authoritative opinions, are the pronouncements of the law. The law manifests or makes manifest the just and noble things, and it speaks authoritatively about the highest beings, the gods who dwell in heaven. The law is the law of the city. The city looks up to, holds in reverence, holds the gods of the city. The gods do not approve of man's trying to seek out what they do not wish to reveal, the things in heaven and beneath the earth. A pious man will therefore not investigate the divine things, but only the human things, the things left to man's investigation. It is the greatest proof of Socrates' piety that he limited himself to the study of human things. His wisdom is knowledge of ignorance because it is pious, and it is pious because it is knowledge of ignorance. Yet the opinions, however authoritative, contradict one another, even if it should happen that a given city orders a matter of importance without contradicting itself. One can be certain that the verdict of that city will be contradicted by the verdicts of other cities. It becomes then necessary to transcend the authoritative opinions as such in the direction of what is no longer opinion but knowledge. Even Socrates is compelled to go the way from law to nature to ascend from law to nature. But he must go that way with a new awakeness, caution, and emphasis. He must show the necessity of that ascent by a lucid, comprehensive, and sound argument which starts from the common sense, embodied in the accepted opinions which transcend them. His method is dialectics. This obviously implies that however much the considerations referred to may have modified Socrates' opinions, he still remains chiefly, if not exclusively, concerned with the human things, with what is by nature right and noble, and with the nature of justice and nobility. So to reiterate or to explicate what he's saying, as you can see, he's kind of a very verbose individual, and so, or Strauss that is, and so it's very difficult for me to read sometimes without correcting myself and sounding like an ignoramus. But break it down Barney style. What he's trying to say is that every society has its constituent parts, and what he means is its caste. So you have the laborers, and the way of thinking for laborers is different between the laborers, the warriors, the philosophers, and so on. However, though they have their individual caste ideal, they do not compose of the totality, right? Because every society has its constituent parts, just like a body has a hand, an arm, a leg. But just because what is good for the leg is not good for the brain, is the same thing that happens with a city or a patria, a fatherland, right? Just because something is good for, the warriors may not be good for the overall organism, okay? The meta-organism. If you can think of a polis as a mega-organism, as a corporate being of constitutive individuals within it who form part of its case, of its organs, so to speak, natural organs. This is what he's getting at, right? He's saying that ultimately the city, what makes the city is not what makes each class of people, okay? And so he goes on and tries to explain that Socrates has to, first of all, do away with all these superficial visions of what the good is and cut to what is essential, what is universal, rather, what is universal in his eyes that bind all these groups together in common cause and purpose. And this common cause and purpose, for him, just as I said before, you can't understand what our axiom is, our mission is, because it's something that just is unknown to us, but we exist in it unconsciously, though we try to pursue it. Socrates, or rather through Strauss, Socrates is basically saying that it is in the common sense, the common understanding of what is good or bad, that is revealed to us who we are together. What is that common fiber which transcends class and binds us together as a nation towards a good, what we consider to be the gods of any city-state, or the gods or God of our fatherland, right? So if you understand this, this is where he's setting the pretext, okay? So he goes on to just kind of talk about blah, 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 how he came about political philosophy. We're not really interested in that. What we are interested in, however, is the law, right? Because what is the law? As Strauss explains, the law is the extrapolation of the divine, rather the gods of the city, the common sense, out into the rest of the city. What is justice, right? And so I'll go on and we'll talk about this further, but let me just go ahead and read again from Strauss a little bit further, skipping ahead. This is Strauss now. The arts are susceptible of infinite refinement and hence progress, and they do not, as such, in any way suffer from progress. The case of law is different, for law owes its strength, i.e., its power of being to be obeyed, as Aristotle says here, entirely to custom. And custom, again, custom in English is what I called nomoi in Greek, right? Custom comes into being only through a long time. Law, in contradistinction to the arts, does not owe its efficacy to reason at all, or only to a small degree. However evidently reasonable a law may be, its reasonableness becomes obscured through the passions which it restrains. Okay? So, those passions support maxims or opinions incompatible with the law. Those passion-bred opinions, in their turn, must be counteracted by passion-bred and passion-breeding opposite opinions which are not necessarily identical with the reasons of the law. The law, the most important instrument for the moral education of the many, must then be supported by ancestral opinions, by myths. For instance, by myths which speak of the gods as if they were human beings, or by a civil theology. Boom! Here it is, right? This is the civil theology, or rather, this idea of what Nietzsche talked about, which is like the overarching theme, the strategic grand strategy over generations, over time, of a society is revealed through custom, through passion, or rather through basically fighting against each other in this common dialectic between factions over what is the good and ultimately regulated by law. I read again, or I'm reading again. The gods as meant in these myths have no being in and of by themselves, only by law. Yet given the necessity of law, one may say that the principle of the whole both wishes and does not wish to be called Zeus, because the city as a whole is characterized by a specific recalcitrance to reason. It requires for its well-being a rhetoric different from forensic and deliberative rhetoric as a servant to the political art. The very nature of political affairs often defeats reason. One illustration taken from Aristotle's Politics must suffice. In the first book, Aristotle sets forth the dictate of reason regarding slavery. It is just to enslave men who are by nature slaves. Men who are slaves not by nature, but only by law and compulsion, are unjustly enslaved. A man is a slave by nature if he is too stupid to guide himself or do only a kind of work little superior to the work done by beasts of burden. Such a man is better off as a slave than free. And I'm going to skip forward a little bit here, so just so that way you understand. But when discussing the best polity, Aristotle takes it for granted that the slave population of that polity consists of men each of whom can safely be rewarded with the freedom for his service, i.e., is not a natural slave. After all, a man may only have, by nature, a slavish character, a lack of pride or manliness which disposes him to obey a stronger man, while being intelligent and thus much more useful to his master than a fellow who is as strong and as stupid as an ox. So he's trying to say that basically, after all, man can be slavish even if he's of high intellect, right? And is just as much a slave, or rather, might be. He is just as slavish as someone who is dumb and fulfills this purpose, and who has obeisance, but is a slave to a man of high thumos, or high spiritedness, the man who may be stupid but is strong. Now, this is not an indictment against strength, but rather its consecration. Right? The affirmation of the will has very little to do with reasoning or the intellect, and has everything to do with the strength to affirm it. And I read again from Strauss. Plato, who also allows, to Aristotle's displeasure, that the defenders of the city be savage towards strangers, expresses the same thought more directly by admitting, with Pindar, that superiority in strength is a natural title to rule. Boom, there we go. There is the essence of what is the political. The political has very little to do with what is necessarily what the word cells are saying, what the most intelligent are saying. And it's fundamentally why in the military there is such an emphasis on character as opposed to the intellect, right? There's an emphasis on strength against, of course, intelligence. And though, of course, it is better to bind intelligence and strength in an officer, or a leader of men, or a warrior, or the champion of a city, or of a fatherland, whatever you may want to call it, it is preferable for a man to be of the character of the city, to control the men who are of intellect but are slavish in their character, okay? Because men who are slavish in their character are slaves to passion. They basically, yes, they may be of high intellect, but their character is whimsical, it's farcical, it's flippant, right? At the end of the day, it's facile, and it succumbs to either inducements of petty silver and gold, or is easily, let's say, coerced or co-opted by strength itself. But the man who is of strength, who is master by nature, who is indifferent to what the good or the bad outcomes of any individual, as opposed to his personal aggrandizement, he is not a slave to his passions, but rather a champion of his city. He doesn't care what happens to him, and this is what makes him master, right? Because come hell or high water, he is fulfilling that mission, right? Whether, and in very many cases, he suffers very roughly or dies very roughly in the defense and championing of the interests of his city, it doesn't compute that this means necessarily that he's doing something unexcellent, that he's being an idiot, right? You hear this all the time, that like, oh, soldiers and military men are dumb. You know why? Because they're so dumb because they die for something so stupid, right? It's like, why not just get, $100,000 a year being an OnlyFans foot model, quote unquote, when like you could do that as opposed to a guy making $20,000 a year as an infantryman or championing of a city, which is extremely stressful. The personal benefits are not there. You're really just actually living a very hard and harsh life, but you're living a life of purpose, right? Anyway, I continue here. And he goes on to pull apart further a little bit about how it is important that ultimately the law must itself be irrational, and it must be coming from a position of strength as opposed to rhetoric, or rather opposed to word selling, opposed to being big-brained manipulator for personal gain. And I read here, Xenophon's companion Proxenus had been a pupil of Gorgias, the famous rhetorician. Thanks to Gorgias' instruction, he was capable of ruling gentlemen by means of praise or abstention from praise. Yet he was utterly incapable of instilling his soldiers with respect and fear of himself. He was unable to discipline them. Xenophon, on the other hand, the pupil of Socrates, possessed the full political art. The very same thought, the insufficiency of persuasion for the guidance of the many, and the necessity of laws with teeth in them, constitutes the transition from Aristotle's ethics to his politics. It is within this context that he denounces the sophists' reduction of politics to rhetoric. So, again, he is saying that Xenophon is the better of, ultimately, this guy called Proxenus, because Proxenus is just a big brain guy, but Xenophon is the unity, a prince in the true sense, a man who understands the good, the law, the character, and the rhetorical necessities. So basically how to speak and lead men well. Basically enact these things by praise and to be persuasive and all these soft skills that are necessary in a prince. But also, he was a man as a commander. He was a warrior. And he was the one who was able to pass judgment on men and who could command men. Ultimately, soldiers. And remember, soldiers also formed what was the garrison, or rather the police, and who was able to enforce the standards, to hold up a discipline within a city-state. Because remember, without laws, without customs, courtesies, regulations, and so on, the discipline of the whole is completely left lax. There is no continuity. This is where anarchy comes into play, right? Anarchy is the absence of laws, or rather the absence of men willing to impose laws on others. Okay.
Now this is where we approach in Strauss the explication of what a city-state is, and like I told you before, I gave you the definition, but I think he does a better job of explicating what I was saying. And I'm reading from Strauss now. The city-state is meant to be a particular form of the state, and this thought cannot even be stated in Aristotle's language. Furthermore, when we speak today of state, we understand state in contradistinction to society, yet city comprises state and society. More precisely, city antedates the distinction between state and society and cannot therefore be put together out of state and society. Blech. See how this guy, he keeps on writing these tongue twisters as if like it's really saying anything. It's a bunch of fluff, but if you understand what he's saying that basically the city, in the Greek sense, back in Aristotle's day, was the composition of both the political and the civil, or rather what we consider today to be culture and whatever it may be, like private enterprise and making of things. This was one part and parcel of a city, and in all ways penetrated and made one with what the functional arm of the state, as we understand it, the government, if you're an American, understands it to be. So I'm reading again now. The nearest English equivalent to the city is the country. One can say my country right or wrong, but one cannot say my society right or wrong, or my state right or wrong. City can be used synonymously with fatherland. Yet the difference between city and country must not be neglected. City is not the same as town, for city comprises of both town and country. Yet the city, as Aristotle understands it, is essentially an urban society. The core of the city is not the tillers of the soil. The alternative to city is not another form of state, but the tribe, or nation, as a lower, not to say barbarian, kind of a society, which is in contradistinction to the city, is unable to combine civilization with freedom. So what he's trying to say is that ultimately, only in the city-state, the type that he was thinking, which is urban, is able to foster both civilization and freedom, whereas the barbarian is incapable of doing both, right? Because remember, Aristotle had as a, let's say, as a personal experience, either Persia or Macedon, and both of these were agricultural fatherlands. And all of them were either civilized but unfree. And so what that meant is, for instance, like the Macedonian king he was fundamentally a monarch and had the power of life and death over all men the same, just as the Persian king, except the Macedonians were a lot less slavish than their quote-unquote Asian counterparts. But anyway, I get ahead of myself. I'm going to continue to read. While for the citizen, the modern equivalent of the city is the country. For the theoretical man, that equivalent is the unity of state and society which transforms itself into society, quote-unquote, simply, as well as into civilization or culture. So what he's saying is that basically what was the city for a hoplite back then, the citizen, right? For the citizen, the city today is to be a man of society or civilization or culture. Okay, so you know, if you're a man of this city, you're also a man of that cultural impulse. Okay, so I go back through our misunderstanding, or excuse me, our understanding of country, we would have a direct access to the city, but that access is blocked by the modern equivalents of the quote-unquote city, which originate in theory. It is therefore necessary to understand the ground of the difference between city on the one hand and these modern equivalents on the other. The city is a society which embraces various kinds of smaller and subordinate societies. Among these, the family or the household is the most important. The city is the most comprehensive and the highest society, since it aims at the highest and most comprehensive good at which any society can aim. This highest good is happiness. And again, I really want to make sure that you understand what they mean. The Greeks mean by happiness. They don't mean, happy, just put a bunch of opium in my arm, I feel happy. No. They mean, like, excellence. They mean higher achievement. They mean flourishing. They mean the affirmation of the will, the culmination of the will, okay? All right, so I read again. The highest good of the city is the same as the highest good of the individual. The core of happiness is the practice of virtue and primarily of moral virtue, since the theoretical life proves to be the most choiceworthy for the individual. It follows that at least some analog of it is the aim also of the city. However this may be, the chief purpose of the city is the noble life, and therefore the chief concern of the city must be the virtue of its members and hence liberal education. There is a great variety of opinions as to what constitutes happiness, but Aristotle is satisfied that there is no serious disagreement on this subject among sufficiently thoughtful people. In modern times, it can be believed that it is wiser to assume that happiness does not have a definite meaning, since different men, and even the same man at different times, have entirely different views as to what constitutes happiness. Hence, happiness, or the highest good, or could no longer be the common good at which political society aims. Yet, however, different the notions of happiness may be, the fundamental conditions of happiness, it was believed, are all in the cases the same. One cannot be happy without being alive, without being a free man, without being able to pursue happiness however one understands happiness. Thus it became the purpose of political society to guarantee those conditions of happiness which came to be understood as the natural rights of each, and to refrain from imposing on its members happiness of any sort, for no notion of happiness can be intrinsically superior to any other notion. One may indeed call the security of all members of society in life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness public or political happiness, but one thus merely confirms the fact that true happiness is private. Some kind of virtue is indispensable even for political society, thus understood as a means of peaceably living together, and ultimately for each other's happiness, whatever the happiness may be. Hence, the purpose of an individual and the purpose of the political society are essentially different. Each individual strives for happiness as he understands happiness. This striving, which is partly competitive with and partly cooperative with the strivings of everyone else, produces or constitutes a kind of web. That web is, quote-unquote, society, as distinguished from, quote-unquote, the state, which merely secures the conditions for the striving of individuals. It follows that in one respect the state is superior to society, for the state is based on what
all must equally desire because they all equally need it on the conditions of happiness, and that in other respect society is superior to the state, for the society is the outcome of each individual's concern, blah blah blah. All right, whatever. I'm going to just tell you that basically you can understand this concept through America, right? Is this idea of freedom, right? Freedom. Everyone needs maximum freedom so they can be happy. They can do their individual things, and obviously maximum freedom is understood as the maximum amount of personal freedom so that the individual may pursue what connotes as the ultimate purpose of any one individual person, and it is at the point of conflict and competition that the state comes into being and questions and delineates justice, right? This is where the state comes in America, and this is the modern understanding, which Strauss is trying to explain to you what we already implicitly or intrinsically understand. So, here we go, and continue reading. Aristotle knew and rejected a view of the city which seems to foreshadow the modern view of political society, and hence the distinction between state and society. According to that view, the purpose of the city is to enable its members to exchange goods and services by protecting them against violence amongst themselves and from foreigners, without its being concerned at all with the moral character of its members. So he's saying that Aristotle disagreed with our modern understanding because he actually believed in the positive cultivation of the citizen body. Now, I read again. Aristotle does not state the reasons which were adduced for justifying this limitation of the purpose of the city, unless his reference in this context to a sophist is taken to be sufficiently indication. The view reported by Aristotle reminds us of the description given in Plato's Republic of the city of pigs, of a society which is sufficiently for satisfying the natural wants of the body, i.e., of the naturally private. We shall say that society, as distinguished from the state, first comes to sight as the market in which competitors buy and sell, and which requires the state as its protector, or rather servant. On this basis, the political comes to be understood eventually as a derivative from the economic. This is, by the way, break. This is me right here. This is where we're at right now. We're in the city of pigs, right? We are basically completely a slave of our economic wants, and we don't want higher achievement beyond sating what is good for my genitalia, what is good for my stomach, and basic stuff like that. And I continue reading. The actions of the market are as such voluntary, whereas the state coerces. Yet voluntariness is not a preserve of the market. It is above all the essence of a genuine and as distinguished from merely utilitarian virtue. From this, it was inferred in modern times that since virtue cannot be brought about by coercion, the promotion of virtue cannot be the purpose of state. But because virtue is unimportant, but because it is lofty and sublime, the state must be indifferent to virtue and vice as such, as distinguished from transgressions of the state's laws, which have no other function than the protection of life, liberty, and property of each citizen. Right? So he's again criticizing exactly where we're at right now, which is saying that the state cannot cultivate a higher being. It has no ability to do so. And the most the state can do is effectively mediate between individuals in the pursuit of their personal avarice. Okay? This is wrong, right? This is bad. This is not a good, powerful city-state. This is a shit state, right? This is what's called the city of pigs. So Strauss, I'm going to skip forward, and Strauss explains that in this condition, personal virtue is delegated to the individual family and the individual person to cultivate what they consider to be virtue, right? So I'm reading from Strauss. Society embraces then not only the subpolitical but the suprapolitical, morality, art, science as well. Society thus understood is no longer properly called society, nor even civilization, but culture. On this basis, the political must be understood as derivative from the cultural, culture is the matrix of the state. Culture, as susceptible of being used in the plural, is the highest modern equivalent of the city, of quote-unquote city. Its original form, culture, in the sense indicated, was thought to have its origin core in religion. It is in religion that a nation, Volk, in parentheses here, gives itself the definition of what it regards as the truth. Boom. Here we go again. Nietzsche collects another fucking scalp on modernity and shows everyone that the origin, the constituting cultural matrix is the religion, and what constitutes as truth is that religion. And it is so dermal and so necessary to a city, to a state, that it's something when you delegate it. Again, I actually don't want to get ahead of myself, right? But what I'm trying to say is that there is this importance of what culture is, what religion is, and why it is such an affront. And it's why Socrates was killed. It's because Socrates was killing the very thing which constituted Athenian society, which is basically undermining the gods, and which underpinned what Athens truly was. Athens isn't the Socratics. Athens was before the Socratics, right? Athens was Athena, the gods of its city, what it sought to be true. And when someone makes attacks against what it truly is, that person is an enemy of the city, because it is exactly the constituting principle by which everything else is bound together and runs on. It is like the chief center of gravity and critical vulnerability of any principality. Okay? So this is why, for instance, in medieval and late Renaissance era, doing things like blasphemy, there were blasphemy laws. It's necessary, right? Quite the contrary. People think it's backwards. Quite the opposite. It is actually absolutely necessary that you censor and prosecute individuals who are undermining the very fabric of the state, the city, the culture in which you live in. And it's why communists are such a threat to ours, right? Because this is principally what they attack as a way of critiquing and destroying, so that way they can impose their city upon ours. This is why in communist societies there's things such as counter-revolutionary rhetoric and crimes, which is why you can go to the gulag simply for voicing opinions which are critical of the whole Marxian ideal or socialist ideal, because the whole thing is built on its back as a foundation. Does this make sense to you guys? So ultimately, religion is quintessential. And that ultimately, what is the extrapolation? That censorship is necessary when it comes to what is called blaspheming archaically, but what is called undermining the authority and the constituting variable of that city, right? But let's bring it back, and let's talk about something that's probably not at the fore of our mind, but natural inequality between man and man. And this is the interesting part, and it's the main reason why modern liberalism is on the way out, is because it doesn't overcome the absolute truth of man, which is that man and man, group and group, both are in an order of rank, which is to say there is a natural inequality of man, okay? And this is seen absolutely. I mean, you can see this on a bell curve as far as IQ. You can see this on a bell curve as far as physical strength. If you were able to maybe think to yourself of a pyramid, right? The bell curve is a misconstruing of what you should really be seeing in your mind's eye. What you should be seeing is a pyramid. And the reason why you're seeing a bell curve is because everything that is democratic, which is our time, that holds equality as a god, everything must be leveled. And so therefore the variance, or what's called a spectrum, it lives on a spectrum. The spectrum must be seen on a horizontal plane where all are equal. And usually
the ideal is the median, right? The average, right? And to be average, to be mediocre. This is the democratic impulse. This is the impulse behind everything equality underpins. It is the undermining of human excellence, right? And Aristotle talks about this, but ultimately, I'll just continue to read from Strauss and explain later how this ultimately impinges on legitimacy and the adjudication of justice. For Aristotle, natural inequality is a sufficient justification for the non-egalitarian character of the city, and it is, as it were, part of the proof that city is the natural association par excellence. The city is by nature, i.e., the city is natural to man. In founding cities, men only execute what their nature inclines them to do. Okay, break. So this is a break from Hobbes and Locke and everyone else, right? Is the idea, these men believe that man is not social by nature, when we know that's a lie. That is a lie. That is the biggest, fattest, disgusting lie ever. And it has ramifications down the line, but man is by nature a social animal, right? We seek company. There are studies that show psychologically it is damaging to live in isolation. It stunts you. It is bad for you. It is something that we were not meant to do, okay? And so even the most introverted person needs that human interaction. We are not living in isolation. You were begotten by parents who associated, raised you, birthed you, and all that good stuff, schooled you. You went to school with teachers, and you consumed television from individuals who created that product. You do things together. The team is everything. The legion is everything. The city is natural. And I think it's really important that you crush this stupid liberal conceit that man is individual. There is no such thing. We may be individuated, but we are always tribal. Okay, continuing. Men are by nature inclined to the city because they are by nature inclined to happiness, to living together in a manner which satisfies the needs of their nature in proportion to the natural rank of these needs. The city, one is tempted to say, is the only association which is capable of being dedicated to the life of excellence. Right? So when we arrive or we live in combination, when we become a team, we're able to leverage each other's strengths and cover for each other's weaknesses. You know, think practically in your life. There are things that you either don't have the time to learn, or even if you had the time and the money and everything to learn, you would not be the best at this thing. You would not be good at it. I mean, no matter how much time people invested in me or whatever, and I spent all my life at university, and I spent my time doing quantum physics, we would be fucked because we would not get very far at all right? Because I have a certain litmus, I have a maximum to my natural IQ ability to see things. I have no personal interest beyond what is general to understand these concepts of physics and sciences and so on. This is why I was born to be a warrior. My interests, my passions are for this. My natural inclinations are for this. And so when we arrive, this is why it is important to always become part of a city. And a city is multifarious, right? It has many faces and it has many parts, just like a corporate body. And it's important to cultivate and to enervate each constituent part and not abandon any of these people, right? And that's why it's so important. We princes, we men of this legion, is what I'm trying to cultivate you to understand, is that as an individual who is in control of a state, or who hopes to champion his state, or hopes to champion his fellow countrymen, whatever, ultimately you have to make sure that you're not simply a man of military prowess, but a man of liberal education who champions culture that
inspires the excellence of each and every citizen within our city-state. And this is fundamentally, and where Strauss talks about Aristotle now, is that this is where Aristotle is in very sharp distinction with the modern liberal state, right? And why it is so important ultimately in good government, in whatever fatherland you may come from, that you uphold the gods of your city, right? So the upholding of the core values which are given to us by our ancestors, right? So it's like Patria, right? The gods of our fathers, that we help cultivate our fellow citizen body into the higher upbringing, which again arrives at this very core constituting thing, right? The collective mission that inspires the excellence of man in their constituent parts, no matter what part of that society they may be in. There is still a central set of virtues which we can basically expect of each, and expect people who create culture to champion these things, so that way overall our city-state becomes great. I think I've gone a little bit too far, and a lot of you boys usually lose your attention span, and I would too, especially this guy is very verbose. But I would say he is a great guy to listen to, and I would highly recommend you read him. I will continue this series and usually touch up upon him when it comes to Plato and the Peloponnesian War, for instance, and further analysis. But if I can give you a conclusion in concluding remarks, what I would say is this, is that if you are a prince, you must know both the martial and the cultural, right? So the civil. You must know how to speak well, how to have good rhetoric, how to be a man of letters, how to lead men in battle, be a good warrior yourself, robust of character, but also beautiful, and someone who people aspire to be in their personal being. A complete and total man, so that way, as a prince of your people, or your family, or your community, or whatever level that has been entrusted you to lead, you are able to be that dynamo of spiritual power that will ultimately give the example of others to follow you, right? Further, the city is no different, or rather our country, because we're not a city, right? The America, the United States, whatever. The United States is not simply the government. The United States is both the government, America is both the government and its culture. I think for too long, patriotic people have relegated or delegated or basically abandoned culture to the enemy, to the communists, and have become cowards and craven, and ultimately do not do the hard work of, and the boring work of cultivating a nexus of thought, of art, of sciences and speech, which entices man to become excellent. And we are quickly devolving into a democratic state, which again is the city of pigs, which we will ultimately become our undoing. Now, I here at Lance Legion, I have a different vision for America. I think the gods that constituted our republic are dead. But that doesn't mean that we're dead forever. It is a time for a rebirth. A rebirth around that central axis which I always effuse you to live by: honor, courage, and the pursuit of excellence. And it is in this society, or rather the city, which I'm trying to raise with our Legion, with great men and women who are listening to this, that I think we can get out of our spiritual torpor and ultimately conquer the future. And that is it for now, but in the future, remember this: cultivate yourself, become excellent yourself, inspire those around you to be excellent as well, and one day, once a critical mass has been attained, we will have that excellence in our city-state. And now, without further ado, I'm going to relax with my nice bottle of Jim Beam and Sergeant Barnes here and enjoy some of this Central Asian horseback riding and falconry. And until further ado, this is Politeia and General Lance signing off.